Before this building became the Gulf Beaches Historical Museum, it was my home. And before it was my home, it was Passagrill's first church. Hello there, and welcome. I'm Joan Haley, and if you'll come along with me for a while, I'll tell you my story. I was born Evangeline Joan Haller in 1897 in Nebraska. Quite a name, wasn't it? Evangeline is nice enough, but I prefer Joan, so that's who I became. Here we have me with my mother and father. Father was a Lutheran minister and mother was a physician. We're all looking quite serious here, aren't we? That's just how photos were back then. My parents were missionaries and their mission took them to Simalkot in India. That's where I grew up when I was small. We didn't stay in India forever, though. Father was reassigned to Washington, D.C. to become a bishop there, so we all moved to D.C. Of course, Mother and I were hardly going to stay behind. It was quite a change from India, but one does adapt, you know. I was a young lady when we moved to D.C., and I decided I wanted to go to work. There still weren't a lot of jobs for women back then. If you got 5 girls together, most likely only one would be working, but I was determined. So I got busy, and I was hired by the Harrison Ewing News Service before too long. I did my work well, and eventually I became the society editor. That was an unusual job back then. There weren't many jobs for women at the newspapers. Most tended to go into nursing or teaching or the like, but this suited me. That's how I met my husband, as it happens, James M. Haley. I was covering a social event at the White House, and Jim was the chief of the Secret Service detail. We were married in 1925 in Baltimore. I kept my job at the newspaper even after we were married, which some did find strange, but I liked my work, and I had become quite the figure in Washington's social circles. People loved to come to my parties. It was around this time that I started my first preservation project. There was a house across the Potomac in Alexandria, Virginia, more than a century old, and in terrible disrepair. It was a real beauty when we finished restoring it. They showed it off in so many newspapers and magazines. We had just about finished the restoration when Jim died in 1951. It was very unexpected. Things just weren't the same after that. Before too long, I decided to leave Washington behind, and I moved to Passagril. I had friends in the area, and I've always loved the ocean. I bought a lovely house on Passagril Way, where I lived for a number of years. I hadn't expected to move again, but in 1960, the old church building was going to be torn down, and well, I couldn't just sit by and let them do that. I hadn't intended to live in the church building at first, but it was an expensive purchase. I paid $13,850 for it, which would be about $123,000 today in 2020. And if I had to choose between my bayfront home and the church was going to win every time. It took 8 years to restore it, and at the end of that time, the little church had transformed into an absolute jewel of a home. Some called it the most unique home on the Gulf Beach, though I don't like to brag. I still loved to entertain, and the former church sanctuary was a lovely place to have guests over. Without fail, conversation would turn to the beautiful old building I lived in. And when that happened, there was no shortage of things to discuss. There's so much history in these walls. Of course, time stops for no one, and I knew I wouldn't be around forever. I arranged to have my home willed to Pinellas County after I died, on the condition that it would be used for a museum of Gulf Beach history, and so it is. They've done a wonderful job with it, haven't they? Long after that, the Florida Trust for Historical Preservation honored me with an award for what they called my distinguished service in preserving a cherished landmark. Such flatterers, I declare. I'm just so pleased they recognize the value of this old church. Now, I passed on in 1989 after a long, full life, but the story doesn't quite stop there. On February 16, 1993, Mayor Horan declared a day in my honor. Joan Haley Day on March 18th of that year. Wasn't that sweet of him? And of course, the results of my hard work continue on, even without me. This museum is proof of that. Now that we're at the end, what do you think? In my place, would you have done as I did?